Today I want to talk about deterrence. It's a term that we use in military discussions, and it means something like scaring your opponent into not attacking. But there is more to it than that, and that's what I'll be going through in this video. Deterrence means to use your military forces to convince your opponent not to start a war or to do something that you don't want them to do. And essentially, deterrence is what military forces do when there's not a war going on. You demonstrate that you could fight a war, and that makes it less likely that your opponent will attack. But if we go a little deeper into the concept, there are different dimensions to it. How do you actually deter someone from doing something that they would like to do? What levers are there that you can pull? The first thing to note is how deterrence is different from compellence. If you compel someone to do something, then you coerce them to do something that they don't want to do. Deterrence is the opposite. They want to do something, but you to deter that action so they don't do it. And to illustrate how that works, I'm going to use an equation. And don't take it too seriously, because deterrence is basically about people's emotions and their conception of risk, so it's not science or math. But it's a useful way to conceptualize it and to illustrate the two most commonly referred to categories of deterrence, namely deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. So we can understand the enemy's risk calculation as an equation that says that if the costs are higher than the benefits, then the enemy will be deterred. It wouldn't be worth it to attack because the benefits aren't big enough to justify the costs. But in this equation, there also has to be a consideration about probability, because chance is a part of war and you never know for certain how things will play out. So on both sides of the equation, we have to take probability into account. How high is the likelihood of suffering the costs, and how big is the chance of getting the benefits? So there are basically two ways you can do deterrence. Either you can increase the costs or you can decrease the benefits. If we look at the cost side first, this is what we call deterrence by punishment. We could also call it deterrence by increasing costs. But the point is that you influence the opponent's equation by either increasing the severity of the cost or the probability that it will happen. So if you want to increase the severity of the costs, you would look for things like more firepower and more sophisticated weapons that can inflict a lot of pain. And the ultimate deterrence by punishment weapon is nuclear weapons, because they're so powerful. But you can't rely only on nuclear weapons. You also need the ability to inflict pain on the lower levels on the escalation ladder, because otherwise you're vulnerable to attacks that happen under the nuclear threshold. For example, it's extremely unlikely that the United States would respond with nuclear weapons to a cyber attack. So nuclear weapons are not a good deterrent against cyber attacks, because you have to multiply by a probability of basically zero, right? So if you want your threat of high cost to be credible, you would do things like increasing your readiness level and conduct more exercises where you demonstrate that you're ready for war. If your forces are located far from the front line, you might also increase your forward presence so your opponent knows that they will meet your forces very early in a war. And on the other side of the deterrence equation, you can try to influence your opponent's conception of the benefits of an attack. And this is what's called deterrence by denial, because you deny your opponent the benefits of the attack. But it also makes sense to think about it as deterrence by decreased benefits. You can do that by either decreasing the value of the benefits, or you can make it less likely that your opponent can achieve those benefits. Typically, when we talk about deterrence by denial, it's in a context where we try to influence the probability of success. So this is things like having a very strong defense force in the area, so it's less likely that an attack will be successful. Or you can prepare for an insurgency, so your opponent might win the initial battle, but will be unable to get the country under control afterwards, right? But deterrence by denial is not always about making it hard to achieve success. Sometimes it can also be about reducing the value of success. maybe not so much if you're trying to deter your opponent from invading your country, but if you want to deter them from a particular action, then that is definitely possible. So for example, if you have a situation where a country is dependent on gas imports from their opponent, then it might be a good idea to reduce their consumption of gas, because that would decrease the value of using gas as a pressure point. Another example that I recently saw was a news story about digital money transactions, and they discussed whether it's time to get rid of cash as a payment system in society, because most people use credit cards and Apple Pay or what have you. And here I think the deterrence equation can be used sort of the opposite way around to see how would such decisions increase the value of attacking our society, because we would create a vulnerability that can be exploited. Like, cash is a good backup system that makes sure that people would be able to get food and that society would function in a war. So if we get rid of cash, that would be sort of the opposite of deterrence by denial. So in many ways, I think deterrence by denial is a more interesting puzzle from an analytical point of view, because it requires you to emphasize with your enemy and to think through various scenarios to see how you can reduce the value in attacking your country. And if you're a small country, deterrence by denial is often the only thing you can do on your own, really. Like, great powers can afford to have their own deterrence by punishment forces that can inflict high costs on an adversary. But small countries can only get that if they're part of an alliance or if they have powerful friends that are willing to help. But deterrence by denial is something that all countries can do if they're smart and if they make good choices. All right, that was my explanation about deterrence. I hope you found it useful. I think the small equation with costs and benefits is a simple way to understand the deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. You can increase deterrence by either increasing the costs or by reducing the benefits for your opponent. And with that, I'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.